Good morning, genealogy friends. Focus in on today's topic. Oh, and let me speak up. I'm sorry if I've been quiet occasionally. It's tough when the kids are doing schoolwork because I don't want to bug them, but obviously I want you to be able to hear me. So I hope that you guys are feeling well. I did not get much sleep last night. Our election news cycle continues to be exciting, so I'm not sure how many of you are tuned into that. I guess it probably depends on where you live. Good morning, Deb. Anyway, I thought about doing something in that vein again, but I've wanted to talk about, finding specific pieces of information that I think are sometimes overlooked, like your ancestor's occupation. This is one of those things that I feel like it doesn't tell you a lot about the really vital things, the birth dates and the death dates and things like that. But somebody's occupation tells you a lot about how they spent their life. And sometimes it can tell you a lot about their personality. I very much want my descendants to know and remember that I was a writer, that I was a creative. I don't care so much if they ever know that I was a lawyer, mostly because I was a lawyer for about 5 hot minutes before I decided that that wasn't fun. But I feel like being a writer is a big part of my personality, so I'd want them to hang on to that. Okay, let's see, let me flip this around. Sorry, the trash truck decided to just pull up. They're fine now. Good morning. Oh, Carly, look awake. Okay, so when you're thinking about finding your ancestor's occupation, there's a couple things to keep in mind. I will just blanket put this out here for women. It's tougher. I think women often hold jobs that are under the radar. And I think it's really easy to make the assumption that if a woman had children, she was a homemaker. That's what she did up until a certain point. But realistically, especially after the turn of the century, well, in a lot of countries, women often had side jobs, or they had jobs where they were helping to pull in as much income as their husbands. And, we didn't just show up in the 50s and suddenly need 2 parents in order to be able to keep a household going. That being said, a lot of women worked with like under the table type jobs. And so you are going to be more reliant on family stories and things like that. So that's one blanket thing that I wanted to put out. The other thing is that if you find occupation for your ancestor, you have to remember that not everybody has the same job for their entire life. I mean, especially these days, I feel like people jump around a lot. I have had a lot of different jobs. I've been a lawyer, I've been a teacher, I've been a writer. I sold children's books for a long time. And so if you are only looking at one record, you're only catching that one slice of time. So keep that in mind. Just if you find one occupation, that doesn't mean that your hunt's necessarily over. So I wanted you guys to keep those things in mind as we get going. Okay, so occupations, the most obvious way to figure out what your ancestors were doing for a living, especially the men, is to look at census records. And I feel like with these teachings, I always need to preface by saying that I'm focusing mostly on American records. American records are what I know. Just to digress really quickly, I got a really good question the other day about my course that's starting in January and whether or not it would be worth it for somebody who's international or if I'm going to be focusing mostly on American records. That is a great question, and I don't have an answer for that yet, other than to say that once I figure that out, I will not be quiet about that. I would not want anybody to sign up for the course and then be disappointed that they're now an expert in American records when they don't have any American ancestors. So I'll keep talking about that. But, as the course teacher, the bulk of my genealogical knowledge has to do with American records. So that's something to keep in mind if you're not in the U.S. or if your ancestors weren't in the U.S. Anyway, okay, so starting in 1850 and forward, the profession, occupation, that's one of the questions on the census. So in the 1840 census, there's actually a spot to say whether or not people were engaged in agriculture and mining, things like that. So you might want to look at that, especially if I think on most places in the country, but when you look at the 1840 census, especially in Ancestor, you're looking at this one page that, it's one of those ones that has the tallies where it tells you this number of men between this age. You might need to look at the next page to figure out where the tallies are for how many people were engaged in agriculture and mining, but it was really kind of broad. It gave you specific categories. You just put a tally mark in that section, and it was for the whole household. So you can make some educated guesses, but the 1850 census was much better because it specifically said, what is your profession? And so whenever I have an ancestor that has, or that should have an 1850 census, that's exciting because I'm very likely going to find out at least what that person was doing in 1850. You can also find professional information in directories. This can be both city directories where I was going to pull out some examples and I didn't pull out a city directory, but they used to list what the person did for a living in certain places along with the information. I have one from Colorado at the turn of the century, and it lists the fact that that person was engaged in mining, and then you can see that his wife was engaged in, I think she's listed as I can't remember if she's listed as a seamstress or a dressmaker, but it's something like that. So look for that information. You also might be able to find them listed in professional directories. It's just that not as many of those have been scanned. That's more like if you found out what their occupation was, then you might want to find out what the professional directories are for that area, for that occupation, and then look for them. And that could be something where you actually have to go to, the Family History Library or something like that, or a local historical society, because again, not all of those are going to be digitized. Immigration papers have profession information, naturalization papers. You've got some professional information in probate records, in wills and things like that. Although, again, that's going to be mostly information about what the person was doing at the end of their life, which might not always, track all the way to the beginning. Newspapers are a good source of professional titles, finding out if somebody did something that had anything to do with their job, they're going to be listed as that profession. And then, of course, newspapers also might have obituaries, which often talk about what the person spent most of their life doing. And then you might have some photographs. If you've got photographs of your ancestor that, he seems to be in a uniform, or he's in a situation where maybe he's surrounded by certain tools, or, your ancestor's photographed standing with other men and they're all similarly dressed. I have one where for a long time I thought this guy was a butcher because he was listed in a newspaper article as a butcher, and he was standing with these men and they're all wearing aprons in a very, dirt floor looking shop somewhere in Wyoming. And in my head, I was like, oh, this is a butcher shop. It's obviously a butcher shop. I missed vital clues that I looked at later when I blew the photograph up. One being that there weren't a lot of, dead animals and large knives around, which I had sort of assumed that because I had found this and because he was wearing an apron, that was why he was wearing an apron. It turns out that it was a pharmacy. It was a pharmacy that they got in trouble for, and they were basically making medicines up. But, theoretically, for a year or so, it was technically, I guess, a pharmacy. So that was kind of an interesting, it turns out that as a failed pharmacist, since he didn't have any background in medicine, he then went into being a butcher. So that tells me more about that ancestor than if I had just thought that he was a respectable butcher in Wyoming. Okay, so those are going to be the main ways. And of course, then, you've got family stories and things like that. Family stories are more reliable if you have people, asking your parent what their parent did, asking your grandparent what their parent did. That's going to be pretty reliable because they watch that person go off to work every day. Am I still live? Okay, sorry. I hate it when I get phone calls on this thing. I'm not supposed to. If you have a family story that's been passed down for generations about how you had a pirate in the family, or, 3 generations ago, so-and-so was a famous doctor, you need to find the sources to back up that story. The stories aren't always going to be made up, but things tend to get blown up or convoluted on accident. The farther you are away from that generation, the more you need to find those sources. So let's look at some of the sources from my own family history, just to give you an idea of the diversity. And then I'm going to walk you through how I found out about the occupation of one of my ancestors. Let me flip this around. Okay, this is a certificate of residence for one of my great-great-grandparents. this is something that's going to be specific to, Chinese Americans, but it's not specific in the sense that you are going to have, this is kind of an immigration type record. Sorry, let me straighten that out a little bit. So you might have records that are like this that you could look at for your family. And I've blown up his occupation here. And I don't know, maybe you can't read that handwriting. He was a dealer in general merchandise. So he was here as a merchant. That was actually a big deal because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. One of the things it did was it said that if you were just a worker, the people that were brought over to work on the railroads and things like that, you couldn't bring your family over. You had a limited ability to bring over any family members, wife, children, anything. However, if you had merchant status, you were considered somebody who was contributing more to society, and so you had more privileges. So the fact that he was a merchant, it meant lots of things. It also was able, this tells me that he was doing pretty well, and it makes sense that he would be able to afford to marry the wife that he married and to be able to have his children and all of these things. It tells me a lot about his social status. Okay, switching to another ancestor. This is another, immigration type record. This is my great-grandmother's petition for naturalization. She immigrated to America from China when she was a teenager, and it has lots of information. The petition doesn't go through until she is 52 years old. But if you see up here, it says right here that her occupation she's a seamstress. Now, I actually already knew that. She's my grandfather's mother, so I was able to talk to him and his brothers and sisters about this. There's lots of family stories. We also have pictures of her, but she was a seamstress for the brand Guinea Sacks in San Francisco. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Guinea Sacks dresses, or Gunny Sacks? Gunny Sacks is what it is, sorry. But that I get from family stories. So knowing that she was a seamstress for Gunny Sacks is a lot more interesting than just knowing that she was a seamstress. But even if I didn't have that family information, at least I would know what she did. And we're going to flip all the way back. These are examples of newspaper articles. My grandfather held a variety of jobs in his life, one of which was that he was a city councilman for Napa, California for many years. And so this is just a small selection of election results and things like that talk about his role as a Napa city councilman. And again, this is one of a few occupations that he had. So I have different occupation record papers in my grandfather's chapter with sources after each of the pages, showing the information I have for the different occupations. I don't have it all lumped together. So those were some individual examples. Let me just shut this right here. And then let's go through this occupation journey. I'm actually sorry, please hold while I find the record I was looking for. Okay. So this is the chapter I have from my ancestor whose name was Lemuel Lane. He's my fourth great-grandfather. I have the 1850 U.S. Census for him, which was exciting. He was 59 at the time. And on the 1850 U.S. Census, this is a very light scan, but you can see here Lemuel Lane is listed as a farmer in Ohio. That's not that exciting. I have a lot of ancestors in that generation who are in the United States. They're pretty much all listed as farmers. So it would have been easy for me to just say, okay, so this guy was in Ohio, he was a farmer, another farm ancestor, let's move on. Because again, with the census information, I don't have other information about his occupations on the earlier census. I just have loose information about the size of his family. However, Lemuel Lane is interesting because, let me get the marriage records out of the way. Lemuel Lane was a Methodist preacher. He was a circuit rider. He was basically a preacher on a horse, and he went around to different cities or village, I don't know what you would call them in Ohio at the time. He went around to different places on horseback to be a preacher to all of these areas that were still developing and didn't have, clergy. So this is not a drawing necessarily of him. This is a drawing, I found an illustration of a Methodist circuit rider. I had not known that circuit riders, that horseback preachers were a thing. So when I found that out, I did some research, but let me show you how I found him. I actually found him, I think it was this one. This is a page that I found in a book that was scanned into Google Books. And you can see in the highlighted section, it talks about Lemuel Lane being formed as the person in charge of the Mansfield Circuit. Now, I knew that Lemuel Lane was living in the Mansfield, Ohio area at the time, so that was a pretty good hint that this was actually him. This is a little blurb that came from the history of the Methodist Episcopal Church building that was in that area. I don't have good citations for that, bad genealogist. But as I kept Googling, Lemuel Lane plus these Methodist records and found other Methodist records, I found his name. This is him listed in this directory, basically, of who was serving where. This shows the different places that he was working in Ohio. And then here we find in 1817, this is a record of the, this is a conference, an annual conference that the Methodist Church had. And I don't know if you can see this. Basically, he got in trouble because he was practicing medicine. He had no training in medicine. He was specifically practicing midwifery, so I'm not even sure, the mind reels at what exactly was he doing. And he also was receiving exorbitant pay for vegetable preparation. So I don't even know what to make of that. But basically, he got in trouble. He got in trouble for being a fake doctor. This was particularly interesting to my dad. This is his side of the family because my dad's a physician. So the idea of having a ancestor who either was this man that was just trying to help out and knew something about medicine and was sort of interested in it and, decided to just kind of do what he could do to help while he was also this traveling minister, that's one possibility. Or this guy was some kind of, not great guy who was roaming around on a horse practicing midwifery in different villages when he had no idea what he was doing. So, either way, that's an interesting story. It does say that he promised not to do that anymore. And then I found other records from other gatherings where it talks about how he was restored eventually to being a deacon, but he failed to be promoted. And after that point, it seems like he sort of retired from being a circuit rider and just went back to just being a farmer. But it's an interesting story. This is not something in which he was named, but this is a history of, the lifestyle of circuit riders and the fact that, they weren't always welcome places. It was a lot of travel. They were away from their family. It's not like they were paid that well. And this one talks about, a lot of them were very young. So they, young people on horses preaching the word, traveling over Ohio. I think that's pretty interesting. Much more interesting than just being a farmer. And it made me glad that I had looked and done a closer look at, what he was up to. So that was just one, let me flip this around. That was just one story that stood out to me as, pretty in-depth research that I had done into somebody's occupation. But this is the thing about genealogy. Everybody has a ton of ancestors. Biologically, we're all coming down being the tip of the same pyramid. And you just have people in your tree who spent their lives doing really interesting things. And like I said, I would want people to remember that I was a writer. I'm assuming that these ancestors would want people to know what they did with their days. So if you have people that you don't have occupation information for, I would look into it. And again, women, it's harder. I had that one great-grandmother who was listed as a seamstress. I will just say that if you are a woman, make sure that whatever you spent your time doing is documented in some way, that you have stories written down. And don't forget that if you are working at home, that you're working at home. I always remind people that I mean, I work from home and have for a long time, but for a little while when I first had a baby, my husband was the one who made all of our income because I was home for about a year, and I was just taking care of her. But the idea that my husband was supporting me always struck me as funny because I felt like I was supporting him by taking care of the baby and taking care of the house and doing the grocery shopping and cooking and stuff like that. That just seemed like more of a support role than the paycheck that he was bringing home. So, don't forget to write down your stories. People want to know what you spent your life doing. And write down the stories of your parents, all the things, especially if people might not find them in digitized Google Books 100 years from now. All right. Well, that was all for me today. I'm getting all these comments and they're blurry, so I'm going to have to, I think, log off and then see them. I don't know why they come in blurry sometimes. They're like pixelated. I hope that you're enjoying this. I'm now worried that the comments are like, what are you talking about? I'm so confused. All right. I will see you guys tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day.